Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Wednesday weekly video. This week, talking about 1951. Quick, short facts to do with things that were happening in that year, so let's get on with it. Now, if you've been following this series since the beginning, you will notice that I have missed a video about 1941. Now, the whole fundamental reason why I'm making this quick, short facts video is because this year, 2021, is a census year, as it has been every 10 years since the year 1801. But in 1941, it was a rather different situation. You have the Second World War. Many servicemen were fighting abroad, and of course, in the UK, you're in the midst of the Blitz period, where cities across the UK were being devastated, whole houses reduced to rubble, people sadly dying, and even more being made homeless. So taking a census that is all about statistics and population growth and how best to implement policy is not a good idea during such a difficult and different time as the Second World War. The other unfortunate thing is that the 1931 census data was largely destroyed in a fire by 1942. Now, you might think that a German bomb had strayed and found its way to where this census data was being kept. But that's not the case. Rumour has it that carelessly an unextinguished cigarette butt was dropped by somebody working at the storage facility, and therefore the whole thing went up in flames. So we now have a bit of a gap. You have the 1921 census data, that's fine, that's safely stored, and is about to be made available by January the 1st, 2022. Then you will have a large gap, and we won't find out any more census data until 2052, when the 1951 census data is released to the general public. The initial findings of the 1951 census showed that 3.8 million more people were now in the UK. But of course, due to the effects of the Second World War and of course other mortality reasons, the population of the UK was actually slightly down on the previous 20 years. By 1951, you saw a population of 43.7 million people, which is down 1.1 million on the 1931 census data. Reports in 1951 were suggesting that the manufacturing and sale of television sets was going to double by 1953. Already in 1951, 250,000 sets had been sold, on top of 350,000 that had been sold in 1950. It's a long way from the slow goings of just over 100,000 by the mid-1930s. Two very famous American spies known as the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were found guilty in a 3-week trial in March 1951 on charges of espionage during the time when the United States was creating its first atom bomb. Another associate of theirs, Harry Gold, had already been sentenced to 30 years in prison, but for the Rosenbergs, the sentence was death. Now, the Cold War and the nuclear age were in full swing by the 1950s. In early 1951, the US detonated a nuke in the Nevada desert. You could see it from Las Vegas, which was 40 miles away from the explosion epicenter. And you could even see it as far as Boulder City, which is apparently 100 miles away from the epicenter of the explosion. The world's first H-bomb was detonated in the mid-Pacific. And reports were coming through from the USSR to US intelligence services suggesting that they had also created the means of nuclear weapons. But by the end of 1951, the possibility of nuclear energy as a form of power production was being discussed. So it wasn't just a weapon of mass destruction, it could be implemented in other ways too. There was a very famous boxer by the name of Sugar Ray Robinson in 1951, and in all 67 of his fights, only one man had actually ever beaten him, Jake LaMotta. So in what became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, Sugar Ray took on his old rival Jake LaMotta and won the fight. A few months later, he would go up against Randolph Turpin and would lose. But just a few short weeks later, in a rematch, Sugar Ray would reclaim the title of boxing champion. On the 8th of September 1951, Japan signed a treaty with 48 nations of the world, effectively ending the Second World War, officially in writing 6 years after the conflict had come to a conclusion. The Japanese then signed a new treaty with the United States, allowing the United States servicemen to be stationed in Japan. Japan was then banned from rearming itself in any further conflict, and it was to lose some of its regions that had previously been part of its empire. The UK Prime Minister Clement Attlee was going through a bit of a political and social turmoil in 1951. At the beginning of the year, there was a coal shortage, which meant that fuel prices increased. The meat ration also went up in price. Now, rationing was still around in the 1950s and wouldn't end until about the middle of this decade. Whiskey went up from just 1 shilling 8 pence to a whopping £1.15. There were plans in government to spend £4,700 million over the course of 3 years and return and to almost cut the reserve troops by up to 250,000. This caused the trade unions to come into a little bit of conflict with the Labour Party itself. The two were often allies together. And unfortunately, one of the leading members of the Labour Party, Ernst Bevin, sadly died in 1951 as well. This series of events and series of cataclysmic events allowed for the Conservative Party under Winston Churchill to win the 1951 election on the 25th of October. The Labour Party would win 295 seats in the Houses of Parliament, whereas the Conservatives would win 321 seats. It's a small margin, but still very much a hard-hitting truth. Up to 700 working-class housewives were surveyed in 1951. This survey concluded that housewives were working 75-hour weeks, up to 15 hours every day on average. So between being a housewife and sleeping left very little room for more leisurely activities. This survey did conclude that when there was a time of more leisurely occasion, women could be found in the cinemas or watching the television, doing a spot of reading or maybe listening to the radio. The Dartmoor region, which is now famously a national park, actually became one of the very first national parks in 1951. The Austin Motor Company are a very famous British brand of vehicle during the late 1940s and early 50s. Now, in that time, there was a very famous brand or model called the Austin A40. Saloon cars, estate cars, even vans were sort of given this all-encompassing model name. In 1951, the Austin Company decided to increase its prices from £31 to £684. Needless to say, the Austin Motor Company actually went out of business and became defunct by 1952. The man who created the motor vehicle company Porsche, Ferdinand Porsche, died on the 30th of January 1951 at the age of 75. The Queen of England in 1951, Queen Elizabeth, not the Queen Elizabeth we know today, that is the Queen's mother. She laid the first foundation blocks for the famous National Theatre that stands in London. In 1952, sadly, the King of England, King George VI, passed away, leaving the crown of England to fall to Elizabeth II. Now, in 1951, King George VI was actually diagnosed with lung cancer and had a major operation to remove his left lung. Often the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, and Princess Elizabeth, his daughter, who would go to become Queen Elizabeth II, would often have to stand in for the king whilst he was unwell, and obviously whilst he was recovering from such a major operation. Coventry was hard hit during the Blitz period of the Second World War, and as a result, one of its 3 cathedrals was actually destroyed in German bombing. So in 1951, a design competition was issued, and it was won by a man named Basil Spence to create a design for a new Coventry cathedral. This cathedral would go on to be built between 1956 and 1962 and consecrated that following year. In 1851, there was the Great Exhibition, a technological and cultural showing display of Britain's influence in the world. So in 1951, King George opened the Festival of Britain to mark the 100th anniversary. A 27-acre plot of land near Waterloo, costing £8 million, put on display a festival of all that Britain had to offer. And a couple of weeks later, the Festival of British Pleasure Gardens was opened near Battersea. This exhibition ran from the May until the late October of 1951, running almost concurrently 100 years to the Great Exhibition of 1851. Flying in aeroplanes during the 1930s and 40s had gone through a great phase of development, and in 1951 it didn't stop there. The Canberra was a UK bomber, and it made a trip across the Atlantic in just under 40 minutes. The Hawker Hunterjet, a very famous model of bombing jet as well, took its maiden flight in 1951. And the Vickers Valiant was a development of 4-engine jet capabilities, also created in 1951. In late January 1951, the BBC went through a bit of a change-up as to how it was going to present its bulletins and newsreels over the radio. A group of 19 broadcasters were going to be slimmed down to just 8 separate individuals. Apparently, the BBC wanted the British public to remember and to know who was broadcasting these newsreels, instead of trying to muddle through who each and every single one of the 19 individuals were. It was just going to be just 8. Another bit of regulation was that the BBC wanted to have 0 dialects, 0 regional dialects, and no women amongst the 8 individuals broadcasting. Apparently, the British public can't understand a regional dialect, so said the BBC, and the BBC thought that the British public wanted to hear news on war, devastation, natural disaster, and famine from a male individual, and they felt that it might have been inappropriate to have a female broadcaster talking about such devastating news. For the first time since the Cold War began, free public European radio was to be broadcast beyond the Iron Curtain, so that the East Germans or the Polish or the Hungarians were able to get more than just the state-controlled radio that they had been given since the late 1940s. At the beginning of 1951, East Berlin, or East Germany, invited West Berlin and West Germany to the conference table about reunifying the country. However, these talks didn't progress very far, because by the middle of the year, 1 million young East Berliners were demonstrating against the United States. And at the end of 1951, when the discussion about the 1952 Olympics was coming up, the East Germans refused the invitation to participate as a singular nation, as just Germany. On the 14th of November 1951, Yugoslavia signed a pact with the United States. Now, what you have to remember is that Yugoslavia, whilst a communist country, it wasn't part of the Soviet sphere of influence like East Germany or Poland or Hungary. So perhaps the thinking was that Yugoslavia was a slightly better country to have on side than, say, the Soviet Union or any of the other Iron Curtain states. Behind the Iron Curtain, in the communist state of Hungary, the Archbishop Joseph Gross was jailed for 15 years for supposedly plotting against the government and planning their downfall. Former Vice Premier of Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Slansky, was arrested on charges of espionage in late November 1951. The Marshall Plan was a very famous monetary scheme to help Eastern European countries fight off against the communist sphere of influence. But of course, a lot of those Eastern European countries did actually fall to communist or USSR influence. So in 1951, President Truman stopped any state benefits to going to those Eastern European countries. Harry Truman, the President of the United States in 1951, offered to sponsor Dwight Eisenhower should he want to run in 1952 presidential election. Eisenhower at this point was still part of the Allied Command Center, having sort of retained that role since the Second World War in some capacity or another. He was sort of switched about and changed different commander roles over the years. In late February 1951, the 22nd Amendment was passed in the US, meaning that presidents were only allowed to serve for 2 terms of office, or a maximum of 8 years, meaning that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was to be the only president to serve more than 2 terms, being president from 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, to the end of the Second World War in 1945. Now, you often associate the Vietnam War as being between the United States and the Viet Cong in the 1960s. But between 1946 and 1954, the French were going through their own Vietnam War against the Viet Minh, who were trying to break away from the colonial ties of Indochina, of which the French used to call that region. In 1951, the French were coming off the back of a number of losses, but something must have happened because they started to win again. Advances on major cities like Tonkin and Binh were being now thwarted by French troops. Now, of course, by 1954, the French would lose and they would have to relinquish the colonial ties. In late March 1951, France, West Germany and Italy formed a group known as the European Coal and Steel Community, which is a forerunner to the larger economic community, which was made in the later 1950s and 60s, which would then be a forerunner to the now present European Union. It all started with this coal and steel community back in March 1951, with just 3 member states. In mid-1951, the Belgian King Leopold III abdicated from the throne and passed on to his son Baldwin I. In New Delhi, there were the first Asian Games held in 1951. In the region of Tibet in 1950, the Chinese government took over. But in 1951, the Chinese were willing to allow some degree of religious freedom. Now remember, in China, in the communist state at this point, there was not a lot of religious freedom. The ideology does not permit any forms of religion per se. But they were going to make exceptions for Tibet. In exchange, however, to being allowed to tap in to the mineral wealth of the Tibetan state, which had been largely untouched by the Tibetans because of the religious prescription that surrounded the region and surrounded the Tibetan monks. Now, after a number of years following the Second World War of the Nuremberg trials, convicting and sentencing Nazi war criminals, the final group of Nazi criminals were convicted and hanged in 1951. On the 24th of December 1951, the final big event of the year, Libya became an independent state, having been previously part of the Italian Empire. Well, I certainly hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you have come to better understand what the world was looking like back in 1951. And perhaps if you've seen my 2 previous videos that I made a few short weeks ago, how 1951 compares or has changed in comparison with 1921 and 1931. If there's anything that you would like to add to what I've already said, or perhaps I might have missed a key detail, or maybe I might have gotten something maybe just slightly wrong, then please do feel free to drop a comment below. Other than that, if you have enjoyed what you've seen, please do click the little thumbs up button, the little like button down in the corner, and maybe even consider subscribing as well. So without further ado, I'm going to leave this video here. I'm going to wish you all a happy week and a safe week, and I will see you next week.